Hi, I'm Paul Wilson, a lecturer in the School of Design. I've been working with communities for a number of years as a designer, design researcher, as a volunteer, member or associate of those communities. I'm currently working on a number of interdisciplinary projects with partners in Europe and in the Global South, and we explore how design research and design-led participation helps to foster a whole range of experiences that look to drive change and innovation in people's lives.
So hi, my name is Marie-Avril Berthet and I'm a freshly graduated doctor. I completed my PhD at the University of Leeds in January 2022 and I have a background in geography. But from a very early age, I had a strong interest in nightlife, as a lot of us do. But I've managed to make a PhD out of it. So I got interested in the resistance of certain nightlife actors in Geneva, where I'm originally from. And they resisted the implementation of a new licensing system, a situation that escalated in 2010 when there were protests and riots in Geneva around the closure of certain spaces of nightlife. So I collaborated with them to support the co-production of new urban policies in the shape of a new licensing system that they designed for themselves in collaboration with the council. And that's how I ended up working around co-production, supporting co-production, also thinking about co-production. You know, as a geographer, obviously, I think about space and the way space is designed, and I write about space. But also my sort of area of expertise is looking at how non-space designers can contribute to the design of spaces and the design of cities. And I saw that, you know, obviously design is at a much more micro level, but I saw that you do community research and I was really interested to know how that articulates with design.
So one of the things that we work a lot on in terms of our projects is very much around marginalisation, social, economic, but also geographical marginalisation, and how communities respond or can be empowered through forms of participation to kind of reimagine or re-engineer aspects of their everyday experiences. So one of the things that I'm really interested in, that I've had some experience of, is how in particular place and the value of place for a lot of communities, the role of the community centre, for instance, becomes a way in which certain narratives can be articulated through participatory research, and that we can find ideas around agency and empowerment within those narratives, but stemming from experiences of place or an acknowledgement of the value of place to those communities. So I've worked a lot with, quite locally around Leeds, volunteer centres and people who volunteer to work in their communities, and to try and use a form of kind of narrative elicitation and storytelling around people's experiences of volunteering to really kind of understand motivations and to sort of make explicit how and why people might do something, you know, selflessly. I think for design research, I'm probably equally interested in how we redesign the experience of participation as you know, as a kind of valuable site for knowledge, and how we kind of critically re-engineer the tools of participation, and how we might need to co-produce participatory tools before we actually start any kind of participatory research with and for communities.
That's really interesting. I mean, one of the difficulties I encountered when I started the research, the PhD, you know, working with nightlife actors. And when I say nightlife actors, it's like in the broadest sense of the term, I ended up interviewing people who were just nightclub users, consumers, essentially. And yeah, in preparation for the podcast, obviously, I started questioning myself about how participatory my methods were. And I think if I'm honest, they were quite classic methods in the end, like interviewing and focus group and things like that. But the sort of core aspect of participation really came through building this collective agency, collective subjectivity, I called it in the PhD, building up, you know, working collectively towards a narrative of this is what we do and this is what we want to be taken into account for. And particularly in regards what you were just saying, I think nightlife is quite an interesting area to look at, but because those spaces are very sort of vernacular, if you want. I talked about neo-vernacular spaces because obviously they are not vernacular in the traditional sense of the term, but they are spaces which are built collectively through practice and the practice of socializing in music. But, they are self-built. Most of them, they serve a certain purpose, but they are self-built by the people who take part into nightlife, essentially.
The idea that you're introducing around their individual experiences, or the idea that there may be an opportunity for a voice, having a voice, let's say, how did you negotiate that process in terms of changing people's perception of their own agency within things that are mostly unseen, and the sense that things just kind of happen to people with very little or no say at all? What was that kind of relationship building process like?
I think first it was as I said, it was this process of like working towards saying we, because nightlife paradoxically is a very collective experience, but it's also a very sort of almost intimate experience that people have. So by listening and by, giving their experiences importance, essentially, they also delivered narrative that showed that importance. One method I used was to connect with them at night when I'd be, walking around clubs and pubs, but then also inviting them for a drink later in the daytime. And that was the most fruitful data I could collect, because that connected their nightlife experiences with who they've become, who they are, how they've built their identity, but also how they position themselves in relation to the city where they live and how they could see this city changing. And then it was about, feeding back into what had been discussed, being present in the media, being present on the social media, and, feeding into that narrative of like, you have individual experiences, but essentially you're all telling the same story and there's a sort of crossover of voices. Then the second aspect of it was more sort of co-production related, more specifically, because from those voices, I was able to feed into what at the time was a social struggle, essentially. So that gave the legitimacy to nightlife operators to enter in negotiation with the council and say, look, you're transforming the nighttime economy. You're trying to fit us all into one model. This is not what we want. You need to listen to us. We're not just spaces of consumption. There is a lot more happening in those spaces that we run and we manage and we design for ourselves. Look, there's a woman who's doing a PhD about that. So that was also very important.
One of the things that I found really valuable in some of the work that we did with a community centre in one of the townships just outside Cape Town in South Africa, and the community centre was a really contested space. It had been built, there'd been a lot of investment, it had been funded very, very well. There were local political pressures, people wanted to find other uses for it, wanted to be associated with it, and gradually the centre became disconnected from the community and was derelict. And one of the things that I was trying to find out in the work that we were doing was, how might you imagine this place in 5 years' time? If the things that you're planning now succeed or succeed in certain ways, what kind of stories would be told about this place at that point in the future? And it is quite a kind of leap of faith that you're asking people to make, again, because you get into maybe the limits of their knowledge and expertise, and they're moving towards something that they're kind of risking, trying to describe, because it may or may not work, and as a way of thinking outside of the here and now, which is often very much what we're trying to explore.
Yeah, absolutely. I found it really interesting what you were saying in terms of like when you work in a participatory setting, you just said, you quickly reach the limits of what people's expertises. And I think, in myself as well as in the participants that I worked with, there was a lot of work around deconstructing what we thought were the limits of our expertise. And particularly in urban planning and urban design, there is such a strong culture in the West, at least, there is such a strong culture of there's an architect, there's a planner in an office, and they will design the city, and then you live in the city that's been designed for you, when actually your experience, your everyday experience of the city is a very valid expertise as to how a city should be planned. And so I think it's really important to challenge that, what we think the limits are, because actually city users or, design users have a lot more expertise and knowledge. And another thing, I think, in terms of how we can trigger co-production and support co-production in the same register, is that often I find urban planning in particular, because it's my area of action, essentially, is very sort of project focused, and so there needs to be a clear pathway towards what we're doing, whereas participatory processes are very messy. They are very messy, they can feel very scattered, they can feel like you don't know where it's going. And, sometimes I'm sure you've had that experience. You sit around the table with future users or users, and you finish the meeting and you don't really get a sense of what's been discussed or, where you got at. But essentially, that's the nature of it, and that's fine. And I found myself an uncountable amount of times sort of between participants and public bodies, just justifying what they were doing. Civil servants saying to me, like, what is going on here? Like, what are we doing? And I'm just like, I don't know, but that's fine. You just need to be patient. Something will come out of it eventually.
That messiness is so powerful in terms of how we ourselves, kind of like realizing the limits of our knowledge, expertise, and capabilities. And one of the things that we always talk about is the real need for a kind of agility and improvisation, because once any participatory experience starts, the plan that you might have carefully designed and put together as what you think needs to happen, that's gone. And actually what's tending to happen is probably being directed by your participants, and they're kind of making decisions about the things that they feel are valuable or useful, and those things are not. And so very often, it can lead to you needing to kind of, in the moment, almost kind of conjure plan B into life in a way to keep things going. But again, I think that's an incredibly powerful skill, or a valuable skill at least, for us as researchers, where we might, in academia, where we might think things can be easily defined or categorized, and the process tends to be clear in how we imagine it. The messiness of human life, the messiness of participation fundamentally kind of challenges that, and often teaches us quite a lot of good lessons, I think.
Yeah, definitely. I think different people have different definition for co-production. Fundamentally, I think co-production as a concept and co-production as a practice is very much sort of ingrained in that neoliberal environment that we live in. So I think, for me, co-production makes sense when there is a strong political agenda as well as a practical agenda behind it. So it's an experience of like producing an outcome, a practical outcome, but it's also an experience of reflecting upon this neoliberal environment that we live in, and be critical about that. So I think that the outcome of co-production, the co-produced outcome in the form of a self-designed licensing system was really important. But what was more important than that was the collective thinking that we did for ourselves about, what is our city? And so how generalizable this experience can be, and how that can foster, new practices, new ideas, new ways of doing, which are going to improve the life of not only people who go out at night in Geneva, but people who live in Geneva in general, and perhaps maybe in other places. And that for me is like the important bit of, defining co-production, essentially.